have this article that came from the Rolling Stone magazine, from James Ball, who we'll get to. And it's headlined Biden's DOJ is pressing journalists to help build its case against Assange. The prosecution of the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is already a threat to the free media. The Justice Department's campaign to get me and other journalists to testify only makes matters worse. So, as James Ball reveals, he was approached. He was approached by the FBI and the DOJ and asked to share information that could be useful to the Justice Department in their prosecution against Julian Assange. There are others who are named, so let's go through them here. The other people are David Lee. David Lee is an editor at The Guardian. He also co-authored a book about WikiLeaks, and it was about the organization. It was really a book for David Lee and his co-author Luke Harding to air out all of the disagreements and issues they had with Julian Assange as they collaborated on the war logs and worked on the US cables and the other files that are at issue in this case. The time period for this case covers 2010 and 2011. So that's important. And then there's Heather Brooke. I'd say a fairly unknown figure in this story, but she's a journalist, or actually, I think it's more appropriate. And she even refers to herself as a freedom of information campaigner, someone who's done this work. I know that she's a journalism professor in the UK. She has dual citizenship. She's got a citizenship in the US and the United Kingdom. She was approached by police. So was David Lee. I'm not sure exactly what they asked Heather Brooke to discuss with the FBI, but there were these notices that were given out, and in each case, they specified what their interests were and why they wanted that person to be a witness for the prosecution. And then you have James Ball, and James Ball is a former WikiLeaks volunteer, and a journalist who worked for a small amount of time with WikiLeaks. But all three of these individuals, they took the principled stand and they said they're not going to help the FBI. So you get these notices, and the notices are shared with these individuals by the London Metropolitan Police. I believe it even comes out of the counterterrorism division. And that's important because the work that has been done on freedom of information lawsuits by Italian journalist Stefania Marizzi is work that has so far failed to uncover a lot of the records that would show the way that the US government has been leaning on the United Kingdom's government or the British government to do its bidding and target people who are in the network of associates that have made WikiLeaks work possible. But we know that that's something that has happened, and Stefania has pursued for over several years these cases, and she knows there has been collaboration between the police and the FBI. She knows records have been destroyed. She knows that there's hiding taking place. And so she's working to try and force the disclosure of these documents. Seeing this article, it's clear that there is a lot going on between these two agencies as far as this extradition case goes, as far as prosecuting this journalist in this case that is an attack on press freedom. So that is an important element of all of this. I don't want to spend too much time on the personalities of David Lee, of Heather Brooke, who I actually don't know a lot about, or James Ball. It's almost beside the point because these individuals are taking principled stands and they're choosing to not go forward and assist the FBI in any way that would make it possible to prosecute Assange. So the headline is that the FBI has come to these people, all three of these names, and there's another one, Andrew O'Hagan, who we know about because the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, they did a report together. They revealed again a notice that was given to this person who was a ghostwriter on an autobiography. It was supposed to be an autobiography on Julian Assange, and then Julian Assange was unhappy, or I don't know what Julian Assange's gripe is with Andrew O'Hagan, but the relationship collapsed, and then O'Hagan became a disaffected collaborator who was writing tell-alls about his work with WikiLeaks. And that's what the Justice Department wants to try and marshal into something that can effectively be used in a US courtroom against Julian Assange. Although I'm not quite sure what it would prove, what elements of the charges it would prove. Oh, but my colleague Chip Gibbons, he pointed out that maybe the idea is that these are people who could aid in their efforts for character assassination, which are going to be crucial to pursuing a case that is so clearly involving First Amendment protected activity. And also, it's going to be important to them to be able to get past this unprecedented nature of it. That they'll have to show that there's something exceptional about Julian Assange. The easiest way would be to attack the character of Julian Assange, as we've seen relentlessly done in the US media by officials, whether they be from the CIA or the White House or State Department or whatever corner of the US government. They've engaged in this, and we can expect that. What I will say, though, is that there is a way in which James Ball has handled himself that I think is worth just highlighting, because it's a bit of a grift. I don't know if it's the worst grift out there, but he has managed over the last decade plus to make it seem like he's an insider of WikiLeaks that has a lot of information and stories to tell about the organization and has some deeper insight into the person of Julian Assange. And he's used it to basically stake out a kind of position, in the way that like a centrist politician might try to stake out a position between the left and the right. He's tried to, okay, I'm not in favor of prosecution, but I don't actually believe in what WikiLeaks was doing in its campaign for forcing and, making people and governments be more transparent in the aggressive manner in which they chose to pursue that goal. And so then he criticizes the person of Julian Assange, and he said things like he's written half a dozen or so op-eds, and he's also written then a handful of op-eds that say that he's opposed to the Espionage Act charges against Julian Assange. He's written an article about like the strange paranoid world of Julian Assange that was tied to the 2016 election, when that was a popular thing to write among Democrats and the U.S. or Western media, painting Julian Assange as a Trump supporter, painting him as some kind of a right winger. This is sort of what we've seen from the liberal democratic sphere of journalism. And James Ball, in order to do this, in order to further his arguments and his discussion about Julian Assange, has relied upon people's limited understanding of what he was doing at WikiLeaks at the time, and thinking that maybe he does have some kind of like insider knowledge. And from what I can tell, he's inflating everything that he describes about what he knows about how the WikiLeaks organization functions. And then 5-10 years later, I'm not sure that he has some deep insight, even though he's done multiple documentary interviews, and he's really done a good job of getting his name out there as the disaffected WikiLeaks volunteer, the disgruntled WikiLeaks volunteer who feels he was mistreated and abused by Julian Assange. He said that all of what was going on in the Ecuador embassy, for the most part, the pressure campaign, which was coming from the CIA, we now know, based on reporting, that a lot of that Julian Assange had himself to blame for what he was going through there, because he didn't have to be in that embassy. But we know from human rights attorney Michael Ratner, who was on the WikiLeaks team, that just about everything he had advised Julian Assange to fear has now come to fruition. And going in there in 2012, seeking asylum, getting that from President Rafael Correa, having that support, not going to Sweden where he could be extradited from Sweden on to the United States. There was conduct that Julian Assange had been engaged in supporting Snowden that we know the Obama administration was upset about, because WikiLeaks took source protection seriously and went onward and provided that. And that was something that led the Justice Department and the CIA and other officials to consider whether they could go after people who were acting as information brokers, as they tried to label them. There was all this redefinition of individuals trying to unlock different spy powers without oversight from Congress, without having to inform certain people so that they could engage in disruption campaigns. And so it's really important for us to keep our bearings. And I also love that James did this thing where he was like, it was almost 10 years ago, where he said, we could stop bickering with each other. We need to just support whistleblowers. All right, well, who's doing the bickering? I mean, it's not like Julian Assange and the people running WikiLeaks really wanted to get into a battle with someone like James Ball. James comes out and is calling out WikiLeaks, and then they're responding to what is said about him. And that's what the Justice Department wants to talk to him about, is this Holocaust denier and anti-Semitic person, Israel Shamir. It's not even his real name, but they want to talk about what he knows about Julian Assange and his collaboration with this individual who's a crank blogger. And in fact, James Ball has made claims about Shamir that WikiLeaks has heavily, and I say sternly, disputed about the extent to which he was representative of WikiLeaks, a spokesperson for WikiLeaks, a friend of Julian Assange's, somebody who was working on the files with a lot of interest and involvement from WikiLeaks. It's just been overhyped. And so he could talk to prosecutors, but I'm not really sure if he would actually get what had happened accurate. So it's probably good for Julian Assange that James Ball is principled and wants to protect his reputation and not support Julian Assange being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, because if he were to talk, he'd be probably saying a lot of borderline false information about Assange and Israel Shamir. I mean, that's just based on what I think is out there. It doesn't seem accurate. We've always seen that these people who somehow end up in the orbit of Julian Assange, who are Looney Tunes, are people who, it ends up proving out that WikiLeaks wasn't really working with them in the way that it was said. That happened with Roger Stone. I mean, he lied. He was telling people things about WikiLeaks that weren't true. Those communications weren't happening. They just were not there. So, but again, back to the overarching point, what we say about WikiLeaks and James Ball, here's neither here nor there. And I could go on and on about David Lee and The Guardian. He published The Password in his book. That led to the publication of cables spilling out, all of these 250,000 cables without any care taken with them. There are names of people, sends Julian Assange panicking. He calls the State Department. He's concerned about what's going to take place. And then he gets blamed. Human rights organizations and media organizations are saying it's your fault because The Password was in the book. And then a German newspaper took it, found the encrypted file. They put it together. They opened them up. And now there's a problem, a huge problem. They can't take the care that they were taking and curating the material, using he was acting as an editor, a news editor, partnering with media organizations to make sure that these cables had the widest and biggest impact and could influence and force politicians to squirm a little, to reckon with what was in these materials. And he couldn't do that anymore. They're just out there, and it's all going to happen really quickly. Everybody's going to be going over them. It's a 1 week. We're going to go through all the stories. Everybody will get bored. News organizations move on. although not really. I mean, they're still using them as some of the basis of the U.S. foreign policy coverage. But I think the ability to have an impact was diminished because of how they spilled out, and everyone's feeling like guilt, like, "Ooh, should I really be going through these? And how can you?" It's like the media organizations aren't going through the material and piecing together stories. They're now deluged. They're just overwhelmed by the information. So I think a lot of the material didn't even get sifted through by reporters in the way that WikiLeaks had hoped. That the reason for that, David Lee has responsibility. He could talk to the Justice Department about it, and they probably do want to talk to him about what he did in that respect. This is going to be a part of Julian Assange's defense, and I bet that prosecutors would like to undercut it. But again, these individuals are we shouldn't be sidetracked by what they've done. And fortunately, we don't have to, because they are taking these principled positions of not working with the FBI to attack Julian Assange. And what the FBI is learning, what the Justice Department is learning, is that it's going to be really difficult to find individuals who are upset with WikiLeaks and Assange, who have this bad blood, who want to turn it into something where they take the witness stand and help set a precedent in the United States that could pretty much blow a hole in the First Amendment as we know it, pretty much end global or world press freedom as we describe it. Thank you for watching the clip. For the full broadcast, join the channel. You'll get access to all our exclusive content.